Okay, welcome to this session with two amazing people that I'm going to interview today on behalf of Maya & Co. I'm so excited to be here with them. And without further ado, I'm just going to introduce them because they are fantastic. My first guest is Dr. Adam Brett, who is a lecturer in education at the University of Derby. He was a secondary teacher and leader for 15 years, but he now works on teacher training programs with both primary and secondary trainees, and researches and writes extensively on the topic of LGBT plus education and inclusion. Adam, that is quite a short bio. You have been doing some incredible work around LGBT plus inclusion in education, so I don't feel like it does you justice. Is there anything you'd like to add to that bio?
Well, it might come through by the course of the conversation, but yeah, thanks, buddy. I think that's a good summary.
Okay, brilliant. And my second guest is Joe Brassington, who is a primary school teacher, an educational facilitator, and an author. So, not very much time to do anything else, I imagine. They work with schools, with universities, with charities, and businesses to support them in creating spaces which are more emotionally honest, equitable, and inclusive for all people, which I think is just a wonderful way of describing what you do. Um, uh, while they've been doing everything else, Joe also co-founded an emotionally honest space with their brother Tom Brassington, and together they work with teachers to consciously construct emotionally honest spaces with schools and support young people to notice, name, and navigate their emotions in an honest and healthy way. And I know that there was a book that came out of this. It was in 2022. They published their first book, Bottled, a picture book to help children share their feelings. But actually, that is not the book we are talking about today. We are talking about a whole other book, which both Adam and Joe have co-authored, and it is incredible. I'm just going to introduce it to you. It's called Pride and Progress: Making Schools LGBT plus Inclusive Spaces, and that was published by Corwin Press in 2023. So, busy people with clearly a lot of good things happening. So, it started with a podcast. This is where this book started. So, how did Pride and Progress, the podcast, come about? And what were your goals in starting it? Joe, would you
I
like to
always
start
let
us off?
I was at Joe start first, so go for it, Joe.
Okay, go for it.
So, from my perspective, it began when I was teaching year six. And because of an incident that happened in my classroom, I came out to my class for the first time that year. And I went home that evening and I realized I don't know any other LGBT teachers. I know a lot of teachers, but I'm not sure I know any other LGBT educators who are open in their classrooms. So I started to try and connect with different LGBT educators. At the time, we were just going into the first COVID lockdown. And I organized a few online events for LGBT educators to come together to network, I suppose, to kind of battle the isolation of lockdown. And Adam was one of the people who volunteered to speak at one of those events. And we hadn't met before, I think, before you came and spoke, and you were brilliant talking about your research. And then a couple of months later, when we were able to, we met in person in Nottingham, wasn't it, Adam?
Yeah, Nottingham.
Yeah, and I think that over kind of lunch in Nottingham, we were having this conversation about the conversations we've both been having separately at the time. And Adam, it was your suggestion, the podcast.
Yeah, it's so interesting how our paths crossed what felt like a really timely moment for both of us. I started my doctorate, or I started in 2018, and it was looking at the experiences of LGBT plus teachers. Similarly, for the reasons Joe shared, like when I started teaching, I really felt like the only gay teacher in the world, and obviously growing up under Section 28 and so on, it felt really silent, very invisible, very isolating. So my research was thinking about the experiences of LGBT teachers. And going into it, I thought all of the stories I would hear through the interviews and the kind of the narratives would be really negative due to the sort of time people have grown up and so on. And while, of course, there's plenty of those stories, naturally, given the kind of heteronormativity of schools, there was also these amazing, like, positive narratives coming through, teachers sharing these, like, transformative experiences of being visible as an LGBT role model in the classroom and the impact that had on students and teachers and wider kind of stakeholders in the school. And it kind of gave me this moment of pause, like, oh my goodness, this is revealing what I wasn't expecting. And it was a really exciting moment. But when I was sitting in these rooms, these people, just me one-on-one, I was thinking, it's such a shame that only I'm hearing these stories, these really empowering, kind of mobilizing, motivating stories. So when Joe and I sat and were talking at lunch that day, I was like, I want people to hear these amazing narratives. So the podcast, it's evolved somewhat since the beginning, but the original kind of tenet of it was to share positive narratives about LGBT plus inclusion in schools.
I mean, it absolutely does that. I have followed the podcast since its inception, really. And each episode brings with it some amazing insights. And I was lucky enough to be interviewed for that podcast. I'm not including myself in that conversation. But it truly does feel like, people are revealing some really deep things about not just their own identity, but how the world has treated them and how they've kind of navigated that space. So I hate to make you choose. It's a little bit like choosing one of your own children. Which one is your favorite? But which podcast episodes affected you the most and why?
I am happy to go first if that's
Yeah.
okay. There's 2 episodes in the first series of our podcast. Our first ever episode was with George White, who is a trans teacher of RE, a brilliant educator. And a couple of episodes in, we interviewed B, who's a non-binary primary school teacher. And those 2 episodes were the most important for me because I went into this podcast with a whole kind of backstory of what was happening for myself at the time. And for me, what was happening was I was starting to be open in class to an extent and open in school to an extent, but there was still huge parts of myself that I hid from the professional me, I suppose. And I was at a point where I was considering leaving teaching because I wasn't sure that I could ever be myself in a way that I felt I needed to be in an educational space. I hadn't seen a blueprint for that, I suppose. And then I met George and B, and speaking to both of them, I realized that you can be a trans person or a non-binary person and be a brilliant teacher. Those 2 things can exist together. That personal and professional self can come together. So both of those episodes, I don't think I would be doing the work that I do now. I certainly don't think that I would still be teaching in the way that I am now if it wasn't for the, I suppose, the representation of meeting George and B and realizing that that's possible.
Both of those episodes are really, really powerful. And I imagine that it might be the first time that somebody is hearing the experiences of a trans or a non-binary teacher in education, because it's very difficult to connect people and to really kind of develop those relationships. And I suppose kind of hearing firsthand a story is powerful because it creates that sense of empathy, that sense of connection. So I absolutely understand where you're coming from with that. What about you, Adam?
Well, in classic form, Joe has taken the two I was going to say. But no, honestly, every single episode influences or impacts me in a different way because they all reveal some things that are useful and interesting. Going back, the George one is important for me to reiterate as well because George was the first person that started to bring those positive narratives through for me in the way that we've described, particularly in the Catholic context, which is so unique. So that was fantastic. But also, George spoke at our book launch earlier this year. And that book launch had a real range of people. We had educators, LGBT people, allies, friends and colleagues and family were there. And afterwards and days afterwards, my friends and family contacted me, and they were just so profoundly moved by George's talk at that book launch because the way he spoke so warmly, so positively, so openly, so candidly. I think for the first time for many people, it's the first time they met a trans person, a trans teacher. So it's kind of an abstract idea, a trans teacher. So to put a face to that idea, if you like, and have that so human and warm and so generous in sharing their story, I think it was so transformative for people, and that was really radical. So George is one that certainly needs mentioning. One more I'll mention briefly is Kirsty Stubbs. I think she was also the first series. And she's the head teacher. And I think she's probably the first straight cis person we've spoken to the podcast in the role of an ally. And the way she spoke about her approach to leadership just really gave me almost goosebumps because she was almost so like matter of fact about it because she was showing all this incredible, wonderful stuff she was doing in her school and how impactful it was. And she was so humble with it. And we were like, how do we get this message to other people? Why is it so important for you? And she said she didn't understand the question. She's like, of course it's important. It's my job. She said, I can't discern between one protected characteristic and another. My job is to be there for all of my students. And it's my moral duty, she described it as. And that really stuck with me. So there's many other episodes I could pick, and certainly including yours, Benny, but those are 2 that kind of really resonated with me.
I think it's really powerful that you picked somebody who is a cis woman, a straight cis woman, because I kind of really think it speaks to the idea of allyship, and having that space that you've got, this Pride and Progress podcast space, means that it's not just about speaking to LGBT plus educators, but people who are allies, and people who can support staff and students powerfully in their institutions. So, it's a testament to her strengths, but it's also, your selection. Incidentally, how did you choose who to put on the podcast? Was this a deliberate selection of people, or was it quite organic?
I think it's become more deliberate. I'll be honest, Benny. Season 1 was very much us having a go. My
Bring it
microphone
up, Brad.
arrived the morning that we interviewed our first guest, who was George, who I think we'd asked the day before if he was free. We knew the stories were powerful. We didn't necessarily know how to curate them or share them at the time. That's something we've learned, I think, as we've gone through the process of creating the podcast.
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think when something starts organically, you have a raft of people, and then suddenly you have to be quite selective. I want to talk about impact, because I think it's, when you have something like a podcast or a book, how do you know that it's out there? How do you know that people are getting it? So, in your opinion, what impact do you think the podcast has on teachers generally? Do you have a sense of that at all, Adam?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's so easy to get obsessed with the metrics where we look at the listenership for various episodes, and that's great fun and it's kind of rewarding in its own way. But I think when it feels valuable is when someone stops you or comes and talks to you or emails you and said that podcast episode I listened to has had direct impact on my practice, or I shared it as a piece of CPD and training at school, or we've looked at our policies. And between us, because Joe and I talk all the time, and there's always that week alone. There's always been 1 or 2 or 3 of those instances. And when you hear specifically from someone that has been impacted by a podcast episode and has therefore changed their practice or their school's practice, that's what makes it so, so valuable. So, whether it's hundreds of thousands of listeners to an episode or just one, knowing that we've made an impact with those stories feels really kind of worthwhile, because, we don't make money from this. It's something we do. It's a passion project. So to get that feedback is absolutely fantastic.
Mm.
You're on mute, Benny.
That is incredible. It really does speak to kind of the emotional effect, as well as the kind of professional effect that the podcast has. Joe, anything to add to that? Do you think it's had impact?
I just think it's quite funny that we can see really clearly exactly the number of people who have listened to a podcast, but I'm still entirely surprised when anyone tells me that they have, which is so strange. But when people do approach, and sometimes it's not even in educational spaces, people come up to me and say, "Oh, I think you're the person that does this podcast. I've listened to it." And it is really touching to know that people have heard it and to hear about what that has then inspired them to do. I think last week, someone was saying to me, "Oh, Joe, you do such good work around LGBT inclusion," and I actually don't know necessarily that that's what this is. I think that whilst maybe we are doing good work around that, what I see our role as is inspiring other people to do the good work in their setting and in their community. And I think when we hear about people who have listened to a podcast and then started their own network, their own group, or changed their own curriculum, or started to consider some different things in their setting, that's the exciting bit for me. The work that they then go on to do, that's kind of the real work.
That is the ripple effect, and I think it can't be underestimated. When you start a process that it almost takes on a life of its own, doesn't it? The sense that you can't even see the impact that you're having, because it's conversation after conversation after conversation that you're not even part of at that stage. We've spoken about the podcast, and I'm conscious that this is about the book. So I think I probably do know the answer to this, but I want you to talk to me about the book. What were the conversations around this? So what prompted you to put this all down in print?
Adam, I feel like you'd be the best person to start with that.
I was about to cough, that's why I go to you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it happened organically, and I think it was probably somewhat inevitable, really, because by the time we'd started writing the book, we'd done 2 full series, and I don't think we'd realised or taken stock of how much we'd learned during that time. Obviously, we had our own knowledge from our own practice, and obviously our own research and work around that, but just kind of how much we'd learned from 2 full series of talking to such a diverse range of guests. So when we kind of took stock of that, it felt like actually we've got all this knowledge here. We've got this real kind of important core of like theoretical knowledge, but also the lived practice. And while it's great, we've got the resource of the podcast. I think that feedback loop of people saying, "Well, this has been so valuable. What else can you do? Could you offer training?" I felt like there was a kind of a groundswell of need for something like this. I mean, there are some great LGBT books out there, but I think the kind of approach we took, which I might get Joe to talk about in a second, was quite unique in how we did it. And I think that's kind of the thing that people have really responded to and resonated. And we wanted to kind of keep the essence of the podcast within the book. So, Joe, do you perhaps want to talk about the way we approach the book and kind of the structure of it?
Yeah, I think that when Adam and I started the podcast, as I said, we weren't really sure what that was going to look like, but we quite quickly, I think, quite naturally fell into certain roles in that conversation. Adam is incredibly aware of kind of the research and the theory that supports these kind of conversations. I'm less so aware of that, but I think that I'm quite good at supporting people to share stories and framing those stories in a way that brings impact. So we kind of took those roles into the way that we structured the book. So each chapter has three parts. It has a in theory, in practice, and then in action. So Adam takes the lead on the in theory section, and we look at what that chapter, that theme looks like in theory, and with reference to research and academic theory. And then I take a lead on the in practice section where we talk about, right, let's take that theory, that research that we've looked at. What does that actually look like in schools, in classrooms? And that's when we weave in the voices of all of the educators we've spoken to over the course of the podcast. And then we pull both those things together to talk about actually what are the actionable points now. So this is the theory and the research. This is what that can look like in practice in schools. Here's some points for you to reflect on in how you actually move forward. So that's the structure of each chapter. And the chapters kind of, again, organically came from the conversations that we'd had when I think we both sat down separately and wrote down the kind of chapters we thought would be important and came together and realized we'd named the same things. It's almost a kind of blueprint of how we can, if we're going to reimagine our schools as LGBT plus inclusive spaces, and that's what it is. It's reimagining because our schools haven't looked that way previously. So if we're going to reimagine our schools to look like that, what conversations do we need to have along the way? And that's kind of where the 10 chapters that make up the book came from.
And the 10 chapters, for those of you who haven't picked up a copy yet, and I thoroughly recommend that you do, take you from setting the scene to, the ideas around heteronormativity and cisnormativity, language. When you look at curriculum, you look at visibility and representation, you look at community and connection, intersectionality, and you also look at leadership and identity as well as allyship and advocacy. So there's a real range of ideas in there. Now, was it that when you wrote this book, did you feel like you were fully versed in all of these ideas, or did you go about a process of learning yourself around LGBT plus issues in education? Adam, perhaps you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, I think that's why the book was such a joy to write. Obviously, we had a good knowledge, a lot of it, but there were topics that either people had kind of wanted more on, or things that we thought, okay, we've got something here from the podcast, but we'd like to flesh out in more detail. So I think we both, did a lot of extra reading and learning around this, which was the joy of the book. I think for me personally, I think spending more time, the setting the scene chapter at the start obviously goes, well, sort of 50-year history or so from LGBT inclusion. Knew a lot of that already, but doing additional reading around that was really, really valuable and powerful. And going back to some of our previous guests, like Sue Sanders, who lived through a lot of that and campaigned against it, to get the kind of the day-to-day experience of what that was really like, but also to kind of dispel some of the narratives at the time, because Section 28 was widely misunderstood, and actually it didn't really include schools within that. But sadly, due to the wording of that, it kind of created this culture of fear. And I think chapters like intersectionality, for example, because that's a phrase that's evolved so much since its original use, which is a good thing. But when you think about what the original intentions of it were, and think about how LGBT people can be differently affected through their intersectional aspect of identity, whether it's positively or negatively. So there was a huge amount of reading around the book, but those are a couple of the bits I really enjoyed spending some more time with.
Yeah, and for those listeners who don't know, when we talk about intersectionality, is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s that talks about the overlap in social identities. So really, you're looking at the experiences of educators who may be LGBT plus and potentially Asian, Black, or have a disability. So talking about those unique experiences as well. Joe, what about you? Did you feel like you learned things from the writing of the book?
Yeah, so much. Because my kind of role was to Adam would write the theory and the research and then send that to me. And then I would be looking at, right, how do we reflect what that looks like in practice? How do I bring in the voices of who are the real experts, these people who we've been speaking to for years about their experience in schools? How do we bring their voices in to illustrate the theory and research we're talking about? And through that, I think that I learned, but also kind of relearned because I was revisiting hours and hours of these conversations that had inspired me over the last few years. And one of the key things that came out of it for me is this kind of model, which I now share with lots of schools that I work with, this model of sometimes we call it like the pillars of inclusive spaces or inclusive educational spaces. And that kind of model that naturally kind of came from the writing of this book, I think is a really useful framework to start schools and teachers to reflect on how they can make their school more inclusive.
I definitely think there's a process of kind of relearning that goes on while you're kind of writing these things down. And I love the way that the chapters kind of interplay between the theory and the practice. It's not an easy task to make something practical when we're talking about identity, but you seem to have managed to do that. Did you work with anybody else? Did you seek advice from anybody else when you were writing this book? Did you ever stop and think, I don't know enough, who shall I go and talk to? Or did you just stick to your contributors and go back to them?
What was really nice is because we had the voices of so many experts in the book, people we'd spoken to on the podcast, and we wanted to keep their stories and their voices in we wanted to check that we were representing them correctly. So everyone who is quoted in the book, every person we'd spoken to on the podcast, read their own section in the way that we'd written it, and then sent notes or thoughts or reflections on that. So we almost ended up with kind of the guidance of the whole community that we'd built at that point in making the book. And that's why it says in the book that we really see it as much everyone else's book as it is ours, because it's everyone else's voices that have helped to create it. And we're really fortunate as well to have had support from Dr. Catherine Lee, who read through huge chunks of the book for us before it was published and gave us some advice and some thoughts around some of the topics that I think I was certainly less sure of.
Absolutely. And it really does come through that sense of a community of people who have had shared or slightly different experiences, who are kind of providing this guidance. So their voices do come through really strongly. And for me, reading it, it was powerful to hear the personal, the theory, the professional, and the practical all combined into one space. But I think it was the personal that really stood out for me, kind of hearing people's stories. I remember listening to several podcasts and just feeling like, gosh, I wasn't aware of that. And I'm just one of many educators. I was an educator not that long ago, who would have been listening to this. And it had a profound impact on me as an LGBT person. But do you have a sense of why this book is important for all educators, and why somebody should pick it up, and what impact it might have on them?
Yeah, I think it's probably going back to the point I made earlier about linking it to Kirsty Stubbs. I think the most gratifying conversations I have with people that have read the book are usually the straight and cis colleagues, or a school I worked in quite a few years ago now. A member of staff bought a copy for the executive head teacher and sort of slid it under his door. And he read it and then he posted on Twitter to Joe and I, just saying how profoundly moved they'd been by it and how they'd not considered what it's like to be in a school as an LGBT person before. Because I think what comes through in all the stories in the podcast and hopefully in the book is there's so many small invisible things in a school that can make you feel excluded or included as an LGBT person. And unless you're looking for them, we often use the Matrix analogy about it being constructed all the time. Unless you're looking for them, you don't see them. So if you have the kind of the privilege of being, straight or cis or straight privilege in the school, you don't necessarily notice those bristle moments where you feel a bit uncomfortable. So I think the most gratifying thing for me has been when colleagues have read it and thought, actually, there are small things we can do to make other people feel included in school, and then them doing those small things and getting that feedback from LGBT students and colleagues, I think that's incredible. So those are the points that feels really valuable and kind of really powerful.
Thank you, Adam. What about you, Joe? Why is
Uh,
this book important for educators?
so Some people who are watching this, listening to this, will know that my brother's a teacher, my brother Tom Brassington, but our sister is also a teacher. My sister Ellie is a brilliant primary school teacher, and she recently has read the book. And she won't mind me saying this. She is a straight cisgender woman who, even though her sibling is me, hasn't probably thought very much about this very much before she read this book. And over the last kind of couple of weeks, she's been texting me every night as she finishes a section or finishes a chapter saying, I had never thought about it like that before.
Mm.
And I can already think about what I need to change in order to change that or to do things differently. And one of the interesting things that she's said to me, actually, as she's been reading the book, is that this has made her think about lots of other areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. Because although our book is talking about LGBT plus inclusive spaces, the ideas we're playing with around curriculum, visibility, representation, leadership, allyship, all of those chapter titles actually are conversations that we need to have in a lot of other areas as well. And although the book doesn't necessarily speak directly to that, it's been interesting to hear from her that it's started to make her reflect on how she can make sure her space is inclusive and equitable for all people, as well as LGBT plus young people.
Yeah, and that's really powerful to hear that somebody is reflecting in that way, because there is still a kind of a misconception that, you know, our society is really liberal and everybody understands what it means to be LGBT plus, apart from those who don't, obviously, and you know that we don't need this education now. But I think we're still living in a space that can feel quite threatening, that can feel quite hostile to LGBT plus identities. So with that in mind, and I don't mind which one of you goes first on this one, which sections do you think are the most relevant and pertinent for teachers today? Which one will make them stop and say, okay, that's really changed my perception of what's going on, potentially in the mainstream media, potentially outside of their school institution?
I think for me, the second and the third chapter, from conversations that I've had, are chapters that have opened a lot of people's eyes. So the second chapter is around heteronormativity, which is the idea or the assumption that everyone we meet will be heterosexual. And we talk about what that looks like and some examples of that and the impact that has on people who aren't. And then the third chapter talks about cisnormativity, which is again that assumption that everyone we meet will be cisgender. What I mean by that is everyone we meet, their gender identity, that inner sense of self, will be the same as the gender that we assumed based on their birth sex. And those two chapters, I think, have been, from the conversations I've had, have opened a lot of people's eyes because they haven't, without having those experiences themselves, they can overlook those examples of heteronormativity or cisnormativity, and they can overlook the impact that that might have on people. And I think those two chapters would be the two that I would say I'm glad they come at the start of the book, because I think what they do, I hope, is engage empathy with the reader to actually understand, why are we having these conversations? What is it about our educational spaces that aren't making space for LGBT people? And particularly relevant to more widespread conversations in the media now, the chapter on cisnormativity and that assumption that everyone we meet will be cis and that trans people don't exist in our schools. Challenging that, I think, is particularly relevant at the moment.
Absolutely, and certainly that was the first thing that sprung to my mind when considering the impact of your book, and how actually those chapters really do set out the kind of systemic ideas around the normativities, I'm just going to say, that perhaps we just take for granted. Adam, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I agree. I think those chapters are really important. I think the other ones I get a lot of feedback on are one of them's about community. And the real sort of thrust of that chapter is to think about the idea of equity versus equality. Because I think in that chapter, we use the minority stress model to kind of get people to conceptualize the idea that actually LGBT people don't have to have experienced discrimination in school to feel unsafe there. So to go back to the earlier point, like most of us or people of my age went to school during Section 28. So our experience of school, our schema about school is an unsafe place for LGBT people. So when you enter the profession as a teacher, some years later, you still have that schema in your brain. So even if nothing around you is explicitly LGBT phobic, you still have this sense of unease. You might be experiencing stress, anxiety, etc., etc. And that's why it's important for schools or other places in society to make sure there's additional things in place to reassure people that they are safe. And that makes the idea of community, whether it's a pride group for students or staff, if that's possible, whether it's about the visibility, whether it's going above and beyond to kind of somewhat compensate for the heteronormativity of all these years. So I think the community chapter is really, really valuable and important. And then I think linked to that is the work we've done allyship towards the end of the book, because allyship is a word that's used a lot. People often pop it on themselves as a badge and say, I'm an ally. Well, that's great. But if we flip that and say, okay, well, let's make that a verb. Let's make that a doing thing. Let's make that a thing that's only described of you by somebody else from your actions. And I think that small change can really make a big difference in terms of how people approach the idea of allyship, but also recognizing that allyship can be small. It doesn't have to be going outside and doing going on the London Pride March or something. Just wearing a small badge or just asking a question or just changing your language slightly. These are all small things. But as teachers, we have such big spheres of influence. Those ripples can be really enormous.
Absolutely. Something as small as, wearing a rainbow lanyard, in school. I experienced the effect of that, the ripple effect of that. It was a tiny gesture. It felt quite kind of superficial, but actually, in terms of allyship and kind of expressing solidarity, it was something that kind of triggered others to do the same. I'm interested in the one on community as well, because I think quite often educators that I've spoken to come from really authentically supportive spaces. They want to support LGBT students, but really worry about the community reaction to any kind of suggestion that the school might be supporting LGBT plus students or celebrating Pride, or even waving a rainbow flag in the cafeteria. And so this idea that it's a safe world out there. Perhaps actually we're coming back to this idea that we've still got work to do. Can we just speak to that for a moment around the conflict between community reactions to schools being more inclusive spaces? How have you experienced this? Is this something that you have potentially navigated, or do you know people who've navigated it? How do you approach this seemingly kind of oppositional idea?
Yeah, I think that it is true that there is. I'm going to describe it as a friction or a tension between LGBT inclusion and other beliefs in the world. Often they're religious beliefs, at times they're cultural beliefs, and there is this friction that exists at times there. And my understanding of how to navigate that best has come from two things, really. It's come partly from my own life. I grew up in a very Christian community. I have a family that are very religious, and I have had to find a way to navigate. My family and I have had to find a way to navigate some tension and some conflicting beliefs there. But also professionally, we've had conversations on the podcast with people who have experienced that friction at times in quite a challenging way, and they've talked us through how they navigated it, which has helped me to understand some of the best advice. Some of the things that we think about in the book are the idea of how important communication and consultation are. Maybe I'll talk briefly about both of those. In terms of
Yeah.
communication, what I mean is the more loudly that your school can name that you are an inclusive place who prioritizes holistic inclusion of all people, and that's LGBT people, but also we want to include and celebrate religious beliefs and include and celebrate different cultural beliefs. The more loudly you can communicate that, then it isn't a surprise to a family member or community member when you are talking about that in schools, because you've communicated that that's part of your school. So that communication is really important, and having that holistic approach where we say, actually, we want this school to be an inclusive space. That means that we want your religious views to be included here. We want to talk about that, and we want your cultural views to be included here. We want to talk about that, but also that also means we need to include LGBT families that are part of our community, and it needs to be for everybody. That holistic approach certainly helps. And then in terms of consultation, what I mean by that is not permission. Because LGBT inclusion and LGBT inclusive educational spaces is statutory. It's statutory for all schools to create those spaces. So we're not asking for permission, but we're making space for those conversations. If we've got family or community members who have concerns about what's happening in school, then let's have that conversation, invite it into school, because otherwise we run the risk of those conversations happening in a place that we don't have access to. And we want to be in those conversations to help to find that middle ground for all people. So yeah, those are the ideas that I think about when I think about how we navigate that friction that can sometimes arise.
That's a really, really wise way of thinking about it. And, it's very easy to become oppositional in these circumstances. But actually, that idea of, opening that dialogue, opening the doors, inviting people in to have the conversation, again, I think using your word helps to alleviate some of that friction. But yeah, certainly I can see the wisdom in that. What about you, Adam? Have you experienced this? What are your thoughts around those conflicts or that friction, as Joe calls it?
Yeah, I mean, Joe's captured it perfectly, but I think the linchpin of everything we're describing is normally the senior leadership team, isn't it? Because they're often the voice between the external stakeholders and the internal in the school. And Benny, as a former senior leader, how busy senior leaders are. I don't blame senior leaders. I know they've got 100 of the priorities, and it might not be a topic they've got a huge amount of knowledge around. But I think it's important that they do prioritize these things, because I think sometimes when there's backlash from parents or the media or whatever it is, senior leaders sometimes want to shut it down because they're fearful for their school getting bad headlines, and that can sometimes be the wrong approach. I think it's about making sure you have a clear understanding about what's going on inside your school. You're being really clear in the communication with parents, and then you can have that kind of open dialogue. But I think sometimes that sort of cloud that hangs over schools in terms of Section 28 and that fear, I think that just causes people to shut the conversation down sometimes, and that can be really, really unhelpful. And I feel like that's perhaps where we are at the moment in terms of, this trans guidance has been promised for how long now, and so many senior leaders don't know what decisions to make on some of these really important, very difficult decisions. And as a consequence, they're just shutting these conversations down, and it means that young people are slipping through the cracks in terms of the support they need. So I think, senior leaders have a lot on their plate, but I think it's very important they do their best to upskill themselves and knowledge around this topic.
I think as
I,
well, sorry, I was just going to say, I think as well, just naming the middle ground that you all share. I too want to create a school that is the best place for your young person to be educated and to learn and to develop. And I know that's what the parents want as well. So how do we achieve that together? But naming that that's our goal for both of us, and that's what we're both working towards. And I think that's true as well in the conversation Adam alluded to there in relation to there are people who hold critical views about trans identities and critical views about the inclusion of trans people. And I believe there is some common ground that I hold with those people. I think I too am wanting to have conversations about how we ensure there's dignity in single-sex spaces, or fairness in sport, or the inclusion of all people and safety for young girls. All of those things are things that I really care about as well. So let's come together and have a reasonable conversation about how we do that in a way which includes all people.
I have to say, Joe, listening to you there kind of fills me with a sense of hope that these conversations can be had, because all too often, you see what's out there in the media, on social media in particular, which is so oppositional, which is so binary in its thinking. And actually, that holding that middle ground is such a lovely way to kind of consider it. Where are our commonalities? I'm conscious that both of you have mentioned Section 28 several times, Section 28 being the legal stipulation in public institutions that you were not allowed to promote homosexuality, which was repealed in 2003, but it's still so much part of the conversation when we're talking about LGBT plus identities in schools. Do you still see it as having the impact, as having the kind of power it did when it existed? How is it manifesting now? Because we can't stop talking about it. It's still there in our consciousness. Adam, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'm always conscious that there's two threads to this answer, isn't there? One is to pause and reflect on how much progress has been made in 15 years, because there's been phenomenal progress in LGBT inclusions in wider society and schools. So we do need to take a moment and take stock of that. Even in the last 5 years, there's been significant changes to curriculum, to keeping children safe in education, various pieces of legislation. So that's great. We need to acknowledge that, and schools are more inclusive than they were 15 years ago generally. But as you say, Benny, we've had over 50 podcast episodes, and not one goes by when Section 28 isn't talked about. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, LGBT inclusion in schools has not kept pace with the rest of society. So there is a disparity there. Whether it's Section 28 specifically, that's almost irrelevant at this point. It's whether they're inclusive or not. But I think when Section 28 was repealed, it was done so quietly You know, I think when Catherine talks about it, like page 8 of the Guardian, a small article, it was repealed really quietly. And we say in the book, there's a difference between repealing something or like empowering people. Because like I say, they're saying, okay, 15 years, this piece of law was really damaging. It's a discriminatory piece of law. We need to do something about that. We need to make up for that lost time and empower teachers and make sure that schools are LGBT plus inclusive. None of that happened. It just stopped being illegal. That's not the same as saying, right, we've done wrong here. Schools aren't safe and inclusive. We need to do something about it. And that not making it illegal feels like we've, until the last few years, that's pretty much where we were. So it was down to people that cared about this work, or a lottery of, you know, you've got an SLT member that cares or a teacher that cares about LGBT plus inclusion, but it wasn't a priority. So I think that lack of priority is probably the shadow of Section 28 that still exists. And, you know, we do training now on people either A, have never heard of Section 28, or B, I've had it where people say, I didn't know it had been repealed because it was done so quietly. So I think it manifests in a number of ways, but its shadow, whether we describe it as Section 28 or not, still exists there very much.
Yeah, that analogy of the shadow really works. And I've had lots of LGBT educators talk about the shadow of Section 28. It's often a phrase that you hear. And certainly when I started teaching in 2003, when it was repealed, I had no idea. And so it was something that was there in the ether. Jo, what about you? What are your thoughts on Section 28 today?
I think it's interesting because every school that I go into, it comes up as part of the conversation. I ask, have you heard those words, Section 28? And usually it's around 10% of the room who have heard of it. But 100% people in the room understand the impact of it when I talk about that. They recognize the silence and the shame that existed in our schools, even if they don't know the name of the legislation that caused it. And what I think it comes back to at the beginning of this conversation, I used the word reimagine, and we use that word in our book quite a lot because I think that that's what's required. And because of Section 28 and because of the history of our education system, we are just at the point now where we're starting to create educational spaces that are inclusive for LGBT people, and it is a reimagining. We're trying to create something that hasn't existed in that way before. And I think naming it as a reimagining allows people to notice where they have that kind of that thought process of, oh, we've never done it like that before, or I've not had that kind of conversation in schools before. And that's because of Section 28 and the shadow of Section 28. And I think that is one of the biggest barriers to inclusive education at the moment is people's perceptions
Yeah.
of what they can and can't talk about in schools. And actually, a lot of the work I do is encouraging people to understand the statutory guidance and the statutory legislation that's now in place, which enables you to have these conversations that maybe you're unsure if you can or not.
Yeah, isn't it a terrible testament that actually one of the effects of Section 28 is people just don't know what they can say and don't know what they can say. But as you say, that comes from a lack of guidance from above. You know, like you said, you mentioned the trans guidance hasn't been released. And so there's still so many grey areas around, you know, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And that feeds into fear. That feeds into fear. And actually that reminds me of a time when actually it was you were told not to say anything, and that created fear. You know, actually not being told what you can say also creates that effect. So a really tricky one. And I think it speaks to again why your book is so important, because hearing firsthand the experiences of people who have been through the education system themselves with their identities, who are potentially now in the field of education, and you know, transmitting knowledge to young people. You know, your book comes at a time when actually we are starting these conversations, and that reimagining is happening. And I think the book is central to that reimagining for educators. So, you know, for me, it's a thank you, because I don't think I'd read anything up until that point as specific as this when it comes to that reimagining. Now, I find books really, really powerful. Most people who know will know I read voraciously. But you know, you did mention that there were lots of other books out there. So I'm curious as to which books you're reading right now that are having an impact on you. What have you read that's had the most impact on your work, potentially that influenced your book? It doesn't have to be. But where is your head at when it comes to your reading material? What's really changed your outset?
90% of my life is reading academic work, so it's a real treat to sit down and read something non-academic. But I'll say something academic if that's okay. I think when I started my doctorate, it was like driving into a brick wall of like academia. I wasn't particularly academic up to that point, so it was quite difficult to get into some of what are quite densely written prose sometimes. But there was two academics called Renee De Palma and Elizabeth Atkinson, and they've done extensive work in LGBT research in the mid-noughties. They did some fantastic work in primary schools, and it was their work that really sort of turned me on to academia and to LGBT plus inclusion, from the quality of their research and the quality of their writing. And their research was predominantly about this idea of heteronormativity, which is kind of the bedrock of a lot of the work I do. And I think it was just so powerful for me to read a piece of work that named heteronormativity as a thing, something that's a real thing we can kind of critique. It's something that we need to think about how it is created. It doesn't happen by accident, and how it can therefore be challenged and dismantled. And the way in which they described that was so powerful to me, because like I say, it's not a coincidence schools are heteronormative. There are forces at play there. But as they're so hidden, no one ever challenges them, and that's why it's so interesting at the minute when schools get accused of gender ideology, or schools are teaching cisnormativity and heterosexuality all day every day, but no one ever kind of raises that as an issue, because it's just in everything, in the language we use, in the curriculum, and it's never seen as an issue. So the minute something that's contrary to that, whether it's about LGBT plus inclusion, transgender inclusion, it absolutely comes under this massive metaphorical spotlight. So I just think it's really interesting to think about, actually, we are teaching kids to be cisgender through the language and the uniform and the curriculum, and we are teaching them to be heterosexual, but that never causes an issue until we flip it on its head. So I think the idea of heteronormativity in some of their writing was the work that really inspired me to begin with.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I know that you've continued looking at heteronormativity in terms of your academic roles, and that's something that you often tweet about. And our listeners and our watchers will have access to your social media handles so that they can follow some of your work on this. What about you, Joe? What's really impacted on you?
So recently, I suppose, as well as reading books, I just want to speak a little bit about the brilliant kind of thoughts and reflections that educators share online through blogs and through conversations they have that way. You'll know, Benny, that I work with diverse educators, and one of the pieces of work I've been doing for diverse educators recently is I reviewed their toolkits around LGBT inclusion and trans inclusion. And as part of that review, I was suggesting other blogs that I think are useful for educators to read in relation to that. And I would encourage people, if you are interested, to look at the Diverse Educators Toolkits for both of those areas, because not only do they have blogs, they also have book recommendations, but there's also videos and podcasts, and it's just a real kind of holistic way to learn about that topic. So some of the blog posts that I was reading as part of that, I would encourage people to have a look at those toolkits and check those out.
Yeah, and I think we forget that actually the blogosphere, I don't know if anyone's called it that for a very long time, it suggests my age, is still a really rich space for hearing not just first-hand accounts, but actually people's kind of micro research into particular areas. And so there are lots of collations of those that I think are really powerful. For me, I was reading Dr. Catherine Lee's book, Pretended, on Section 28, and actually having grown up as a child through Section 28, I don't think I realize, you don't recognize as a child the impact of that, other than you haven't been given access to a huge slice of information about life, and that potentially you feel quite isolated because of it. But I don't think I understood it from the perspective of teachers, and how fearful teachers were around what would happen to them if Section 28 was breached, to use a term. But that was a really powerful book for me. And there'll be a book list attached to this, and certainly we can put some of your recommendations into the resources that our watchers will have access to. So we're coming towards the end of the conversation, and I hate to put people on the spot, but I'd really like you to nail your colours to the mast, if you like, all of the colours. And I think, you've written the book, you've done the podcast, you are in educational spaces, you're working in the fields of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So how can you distill that down into 3 things that educators should know or know how to do to support LGBT plus young people in schools? Joe, I'm going to pick on you first. I know it's terrible, isn't it?
Okay, 3 things that I want educators to know about LGBT plus inclusion. I want you to know that, let's start with the very basics. LGBT people exist. There are LGBT young people in your school. There are likely LGBT teachers and educators in your school. And certainly there will be LGBT people in your community of the families who you serve. That's the first thing I want you to be very sure of. Secondly, LGBT people experience inequalities and barriers because of our systems and our structures and how they've been set up in a way that aren't necessarily catered to serve those particular groups of people or those identities. That's the second thing I want you to be aware of. And there's lots of research that supports that that's the case. And then the third thing I want you to know is if LGBT people exist, and they're experiencing challenges or inequalities, then I hope that the question you're asking is, what can we do? The third thing that I want you to be really reflect on, I suppose, and it's what I end so many of my training sessions talking about, and it's an idea that comes from Alok Vaid-Menon, who's a non-binary poet and thinker and speaker. And one of the things that Alok says is that so often when we talk about inclusion, and particularly when we talk about LGBT inclusion, we focus so much on comprehension. People say, I just don't get it. I don't understand what it means to be trans. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand. But sometimes when we focus on comprehension, we sidestep compassion. And actually, you don't need to understand a group of people in order to not want them to experience challenges in schools and to want them to feel like they belong there. So I think the third thing that I would say is I want you to think really carefully about what a compassionate response looks like. So you don't have to have understood everything that we've said in this call, in this conversation today. You don't actually even have to agree with some of the things that we've talked about today in order to have a compassionate response, in order to want to create schools where everyone can experience belonging.
That's really, really, really powerful. And I love the idea of kind of comprehension sometimes superseding compassion, and how do we bring compassion back into the classroom for our young people, regardless of who they are. Adam, over to you. 3 things.
I don't. Well, I don't know how we've got through this whole episode without mentioning Sue Sanders. So here's the time for Sue Sanders discussion. So Sue Sanders, we're all huge fans of Sue Sanders from the podcast a couple of times, but I want to take her word of usualize just for my kind of final point. Sue Sanders talks about the importance of usualizing LGBT identities in the classroom and in life. And obviously she uses the word usualize because normal has connotations of abnormal, but usualizes the small and the everyday. I think schools even now still have the gay lesson, or the lesson on disability, or the lesson on race, and usualizing is just creating that small golden thread that goes through everything. And it can be really small examples, just changing the names used in a question for maths or English or something like that. At my university the other day, one of the professors was giving her inaugural talk. So a big talk to a room of 500 people, an amazing talk for over an hour. And within it, she gave an analogy about a couple. And she just said Steve and her husband as the example. These are fictional people. And it was such a small thing. But me sitting there in the audience as a 40-year-old, I still felt seen. So that, if I felt seen in that room of adults and academics, just imagine how much it can mean for a young person in the school to have just one small example dripped throughout the lesson, because it utilizes it, it makes it every day, and it just gives these little blueprints for people to sort of, to feel seen. And, the idea of curriculum being mirrors and windows, it just gives the opportunity for people to see themselves in the work they're doing. So to usualize, I think, is so valuable and so powerful. I think Joe's probably said the most of the things I was going to say, but I think is to remain curious is my final thing. I think LGBT is an ever evolving and moving and changing field, and all 3 of us work hard to keep up to date with it, but sometimes moves beyond the speeds we can't keep up with. So that's okay. We don't have to all be experts in LGBT plus inclusion, but we can be curious. We can ask questions and be respectful, as Joe's talked about, and do our best. So I think having that curiosity and that passion to do better is one of the best things we can hold close.
I think actually you've got the basis of the 3 C's there. You've got you know, the comprehension, which is important in the sense you do have to comprehend, learn how to navigate the space, that compassion, which cannot be the bottom of the hierarchy, and that curiosity around, you know, asking the questions and learning that really kind of then formulate a safe space, an inclusive space for LGBT plus young people in schools. I'm conscious that we are coming towards the end of our time, and I just wanted to say a huge thank you because, you know, for me, reading this book was a real watershed moment, because not only was I hearing some brilliant advice and really kind of hearing the theory behind inclusive spaces in schools, but I was meeting people like me through the chapters. And, you know, it's not just a book for LGBT educators, this is a book for everybody. And I can't overstate enough how powerful it is in terms of building empathy with real people who have been through so much in order to build a better society. And there's just some really practical advice in there as well, and it's beautifully referenced. And so it's a huge thank you for me. I hold it up here so it doesn't get blurred out. It's a huge thank you for writing it. And I all that's left to say is thank you for this podcast as well, for this video as well, because I appreciate that you're really busy. But hearing from you has been an absolute pleasure. So I just like to finish off by saying thank you once more, and to all of our watchers, you will find all of the details of contact for Dr. Adam Brett and for Joe Brassington in the notes. And if you do have any further questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. So thank you very much. That is the end of this show.
Thanks so much, Benny.